Welcome to our webcast on helping children cultivate resilience during stressful times. I'm Nicole from Western Alumni. We are incredibly grateful to spend this time with you and learn together. Before we get started, I want to mention a few housekeeping items. You will have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the session today. There is a Q&A feature on your screen. Please use that to ask your question. We have built in some time at the end to address as many as we can. We are recording today's webcast. A link will be emailed to you when we have the recording and the presentation slides posted. We're joined today by our facilitator, Claire Crooks. Claire is the Director, Center for School Mental Health, and a professor in the Faculty of Education. Claire, over to you to get us started.
All right, thanks, Nicole. If you can hear me all right? All right. Okay, well, morning and welcome to this webinar on helping children cultivate resilience. As Nicole noted, I'm the Director of Center for School Mental Health at Western. We develop and implement and evaluate programming to promote well-being and prevent violence in both school and community settings. At the center, I have a team of 15 staff and 11 grad students, and we currently are overseeing about $7 million in grant-funded projects. I'm also a registered clinical psychologist and have 20 years of experience providing support for children and families in that capacity. However, I think it's important to provide all of my credentials here so you can decide how much weight to put on the information I'm about to share. Beyond being a researcher and clinician, I'm also the mother of 4 children, ages 7 to 14. And we're currently doing our physical distancing in my parents' small ski condo in British Columbia. We came out at the beginning of March for a 2-week visit, and here we are almost 2 months later. So I'm literally doing this webinar from a small cedar sauna, a windowless sauna, because it is the only place where my husband and I can get a moment privately for work. So we're also, like all of you, living this challenge of trying to create structure and stability for children, and not to mention trying to figure out Google Classrooms while also trying to adjust to the current situation and figure out what it means for our other responsibilities. And when I was thinking about what guidance I wanted to share today, I thought, I should take an honest look at how things are going for my family right now as we adjust to this new normal. So I was starting to think about how to frame my talk, and I walked up to the living room, and this is what I found. So here's 3 of my children kind of flopped and mopey on the couch, kind of unwashed, some clutter starting to crowd in from the peripheries. And it's, it's not our best day in quarantine, and it's certainly not our worst. But I guess I just want to offer the guidance in this webinar with compassion and humility. This is a challenging time for all families, and I don't know anyone who's winning the Parent of the Year award on a daily basis. As a matter of fact, last night at dinner, I mentioned that I was doing a webinar today, and my kid said, "Oh, that's cool, Mom. Like, what's it on?" And I said, "Well, it's on resilience and maybe how to be a bit of a better parent during this pandemic." And my 12-year-old just tilted her head at me and said, "No, really, Mom, what's it on?" So I'm not sure that I have the same vote of credentials for my own family. Anyway, there are some simple research-based strategies, though, that we can all incorporate into our daily routines right now to promote resilience, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So my objectives over the next half hour, I want to start by thinking about how stress affects children and how it impacts brain's development functioning. I also want to talk about resilience and what we know about where resilience comes from. I'm going to briefly describe a project that we're conducting with the London District Catholic School Board and some of the positive impacts we're seeing with that project. And then finally give some concrete ideas about how those strategies that are showing so much promise in our research context can be brought into your home during this unusual time. So first of all, is stress a bad thing? We recognize that this is a stressful time for families. Everybody says that. We are all feeling it. Even pre-pandemic, we have seen a steady increase in stress levels among children and youth over the last couple of decades. So is stress necessarily a bad thing? And I think, stress itself is our physiological response to a demand or threat. So when we experience these demands, our sympathetic nervous system kicks into gear, our heart rate goes up a bit, our blood pressure can increase, our palms get sweaty. Like that's the stress response. There's stress hormones that get released. Is this a bad thing? Well, before we can answer that question, we need to think a little bit about brain development in kids and also how stress affects children's and adults' brains and bodies. So brains develop in children starting prenatally in a sequential and predictable way. When babies are born, they have a lot of neurons, almost all the neurons that they'll ever have in their brains, but they aren't really connected yet. So they have more neurons or more components than adult brains, but they're not yet connected with these pathways that allow for effective transmission of brain information. So over childhood, certainly there's a big period of growth in 0 to 3, but all the way up through adolescence, we see this sequential predictable development that's affected by what we call an epigenetic process. So there's certainly genetic input into brain development for children, but a lot of these genes are expressed depending on the context of that early experience. So that's why something like attachment is so important, because that attachment experience with a primary caregiver changes the way that brain architecture unfolds through an epigenetic process. We also know that brains develop from the bottom up, or sometimes people talk about a downstairs brain or an upstairs brain, and the bottom part of our brain is sort of our most primitive part. And so as our brain's wiring and developing more and more of these neuronal connections, one of the first parts of the brain to develop is the amygdala. And the amygdala is involved in instinctive, impulsive, emotional, aggressive reactions. It's really that fight or flight center of your brain. And it's great for keeping you alive if there's trouble, but it's not always great when it comes to making balanced decisions. So to make decisions, the front part of the brain needs to be involved. That's the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is kind of the calm down or sensible, logical part of the brain that's able to consider consequences and kind of put the brakes on the more emotional part of the brain or decisions that might cause trouble. The challenge here is that the prefrontal cortex is really not fully developed until the mid-20s, which explains some of the behaviors that we see in teens, for example, because the growth of their amygdala really outpaces the prefrontal cortex. So we see more emotional responding, we see higher risk taking, less consideration of consequences. And furthermore, we know that when the amygdala is really activated in children or teens or adults, it can circumvent the prefrontal cortex. Like information can go, you can function on amygdala information without it being mediated through that kind of thinking, reasonable part of your brain. And this really makes sense from a design perspective, because in a life or death situation, you don't want to waste time making lists of pros and cons of various options or considering your different plans. You need to react. The problem then is when kids feel threatened or activated, that they can't access the sensible part of their brain, which is still being developed anyway. And those pathways need to be hardwired and reinforced across childhood and adolescence. So when we think about, and actually furthermore, it's really this use it or lose it process. So the brain starts with way more connections than it needs, like by early childhood, by around age 6. And then there starts to be a process that's actually called pruning. So you think like a gardening kind of metaphor, where pathways that aren't being used get pruned or die off, and the pathways that are used most often get strengthened and become faster and faster in terms of people's ability to access them. And so, learning an automatic behavior would be an example of that, where it just gets easier and faster over time. Unfortunately, if children's brains are developed to a lot of stress and a lot of fight or flight, then those are the pathways that get really activated. So we can see this almost like a superhighway effect of the stress response center that gets hard for kids to work around. So when we go back to our question, is stress a bad question? It really depends. So stress in and of itself is not necessarily bad. And this is a classic stress performance curve here that shows you have too little stress, an optimal amount of activation, or too much stress. So if you look at the figure on the left with the sleeping, that person has too little stress to perform. So you could think about being at the start of a race and being so relaxed that you're yawning, you're feeling pretty chill, maybe there's not many stress hormones affecting the body, you're not feeling that motivated, the race starts, you're not going to have your best performance. There's positive stress, this moderate degree can bring on optimal performance. So just sort of enough adrenaline to be able to do well in your race, or cognitively, if you're writing a test and have that kind of focus and alertness. But unfortunately, the figure on the high end is what we see more commonly, which is with people being too far up the stress performance curve. And that's where, again, our amygdalas are fired up, we're being flooded with stress hormones, and it's much harder to perform well. So one piece of whether or not stress is good is kind of how much stress. The other important piece is sort of the chronicity of it across childhood and adolescence. So we have this idea of positive stress. So when a child is protected by supportive relationships with adults, they learn to cope with everyday challenges and stress. So going to school for the first time for a slightly shy child might be stressful, but when they do it, it's a learning opportunity, and it builds on their ability to self-regulate during stress. This next level, sort of more tolerable, is that when children and youth and adults, when we face more serious difficulties, so something that is really stressful and upsetting, but the impact of the stress can still be buffered by a caring adult who can help the child adapt, and long-term effects are mitigated. At this kind of toxic or traumatic level, we see kids who have strong and frequent prolonged adverse experiences without adult support and resources to help manage them. And it's this chronicity over time and sort of the layers of stress and insults that are most difficult in terms of long-term consequences. So the problem with the toxic or traumatic stress is that our brains and bodies were not designed for this type of stress. So remember I said brains hardwire and prune on a use it or lose it basis, but kids who are living with toxic or traumatic stress, again, there's this kind of efficiency or speed with which that system gets wired. And it's really hard to build those off ramps to more thoughtful and deliberate types of behavior. So when kids are living with toxic stress, that continued experience of stress and fight or flight makes it difficult to develop some of those other self-regulatory capacities. So when you think about this current pandemic and what type of stress of this, it kind of depends. It depends a bit, on other experiences that children and youth have had. It depends on what they have to help balance out the stress. So the impact on children and caregivers will depend partly on what they were dealing with pre-pandemic. So it depends on the resources they have to balance out the stress, and those can be financial resources, also the emotional support available to children. So parents who are dealing with daily risks in their job, food or housing insecurity, or maybe triggered by the current situation to remember times when they didn't have enough food themselves, or there's lots of different types of triggers right now, they're going to have fewer resources to support their children. And this isn't a criticism. It's really a reminder for us to be compassionate and recognize that our current experience of the pandemic is unique to our family, and that not everybody is coming into this with the same experiences and has the same resources to handle it. So switching now to resilience. So if stress, and particularly toxic stress, is sort of one side of the coin, then resilience is that other side of the coin. And resilience is the ability to overcome adversity, that sort of bounce back factor. And as a researcher and clinician, I'm in awe of the resilience shown by children and their families in really difficult situations. And in the early days of studying resilience, we made the mistake of thinking it was something inherent to individuals, that kids were either resilient or they weren't, and it was just sort of this characteristic. And we really had that wrong. And over time, we've come to understand that resilience can stem from inherent characteristics. So being sociable or optimistic can help promote resilience, for example. But resilience is really a capacity that comes out of available resources and relationships at different levels of a child's world. So if we think again about how somebody might be sort of managing stress during the current situation, there's these risk factors on one side, including earlier experiences of adversity or pre-existing challenges. So the experience of children or caregivers who are coming into this with pre-existing anxiety disorders or obsessive compulsive disorder, PTSD, even sleep problems. Those things are going to be exacerbated and be potentially additional risk. But there's lots of opportunities for us to bolster protective factors. And we know that protective factors can occur at the individual level, at the family level, and in context of relationships with other caregivers, at the community level. Obviously, it's harder to access some community resources in the current pandemic because of the physical distancing restrictions. So that also can be challenging because kids can have less contact with some of the relationships to teachers, coaches, grandparents, extended family that may buffer stress in other times. So how can we promote resilience and self-regulation now? If we recognize that this prolonged period of stress has the potential to feel more like toxic stress, how do we promote resilience and self-regulation? And a couple things I just want to say to frame this. One is that, again, we have to recognize the impact of the current circumstances on us as adults, because children's well-being is inherently tied to the well-being and regulation of the adults caring for them. It's again, I think it's a time for compassion for our children, also for ourselves as parents, for parents around us. I even try to find compassion for parents who post pictures of their perfectly organized homeschooling calendar and all the extra activities they're managing to do to enrich their children right now. That hasn't been my experience of the pandemic, but everybody's coming into this differently. I would suggest now is not the time to try and revolutionize your parenting and routines and make these huge sweeping changes that children do find comfort in routine. And so trying to introduce a whole new way of doing things is probably not good timing. Having said that, we can look at incorporating some research-based strategies. And the strategies that I chose to highlight today are ones that have good evidence behind them. They're also ones I picked purposefully because they really can be incorporated into, it's more about how we're doing things and not trying to add a whole new layer of tasks that we're trying to get done during this time. So the strategies that I'm going to talk about come from the Mind Up, are related to Mind Up program, which is a project we have at the Center for School Mental Health. So over the past 4 years, we've been working with the London District Catholic School Board to implement and evaluate Mind Up. And Mind Up is a curriculum-based approach and activities that are integrated into daily practice by teachers. So we began 4 years ago by having kindergarten teachers implement it, and it was so successful that the board decided to grow the program by adding a grade level each year. So essentially Mind Up rolled out through elementary grades with that first set of students, and those first kids are now in grade 3. So Mind Up was designed to draw on 4 areas: neuroscience, so both incorporating an understanding of how our brains work, but also teaching children explicitly how their brains work so they have that knowledge. Positive psychology, which is really this focus on cultivating positive well-being and meaning versus just reducing negative behaviors or symptoms. Social emotional learning, which is an area that's developed over the past 30 years that really underscores the importance of explicitly teaching skills such as self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, decision-making, and relationship skills. And finally, mindful awareness. And Mind Up has different classroom lessons and extension activities, but a big part of it is these brain breaks that I'm going to talk about. So this wheel just shows all the different class or lessons for the Mind Up. So under neuroscience, you see learning about your brain, mindfulness, focused attention, and there's these different things that go under each of those sections. And I would point out, actually, I'm going to give you our center website at the end. And if you're interested in this particular project or this research, we have quite a bit of information on our website. So really what we've learned over the past 4 years is that when you incorporate these things into the classroom, acting with gratitude, choosing optimism, mindful listening, focused attention, that kids thrive even in the face of adversity. And the way our research worked, this is one that I'm showing you, the kindergarten cohort. We had 17 schools, 54 classrooms split into whether or not they were just doing the typical kindergarten program or whether they were doing Mind Up. And what we found is the kids who were actually in the in the comparison schools those schools had more risk and adversity to begin with. So the kids' families in those schools as a group had higher rates of poverty and some other related challenges. So at the pretest, we found that the kids in the Mind Up group were actually quite a bit behind their peers. And we're looking at things like behavior symptoms, both internalizing, so that kind of inward facing, more like sadness and anxious symptoms, as well as externalizing. We looked at executive functioning, and we looked at adaptive functioning. And after a year where in classrooms where teachers incorporated these skills and lessons, the Mind Up kids had essentially closed that gap and there was no difference. And furthermore, what we saw is that on some things like internalizing problems, kids in comparisons groups actually got worse over the course of the year, significantly worse. So school was actually a bit stressful for them, or they developed more symptoms of anxiety and sadness over that course of the school year. And the Mind Up kids significantly improved and caught up. Again, there was no cap. So really it's incorporating these concepts about neuroscience, positive psychology, and mindfulness had significant and widespread impacts. In the last 10 minutes of this talk, I really want to share some ideas about how you can bring these concepts into your homes and families. I will also point out there's a couple places where I had videos embedded, and I had not checked about Zoom being able to do video. So we have a few mystery spots where I'd hope to have a video, but do not. So this first strategy about teaching kids how their brains work. So even very young children can understand their brains work, even in junior kindergarten. And it's sort of amazing that we don't teach this to all children as part of their education. So we think about what kids learn in health class or biology. They learn how their respiratory systems work. They learn how their digestive systems work, but not how their brains work, which is pretty amazing. So when children learn about the amygdala as the threat center, for example, it gives them a language and concepts to understand their experience. And it also gives them compassion towards other children who are overwhelmed and acting out. So it gives them a way of talking about their experience that is less shameful, that they can actually, teachers talk about kids coming in from recess and say, oh, my amygdala is really, really upset and I need to go to the calming corner. I need to do my breathing and recognizing they need a bit of a break. And really that capacity to recognize what you need and take steps to get it. So I need a break. I'm starting to feel fired up. I need to calm down. That's the heart of self-regulation. So that's a really important capacity to be developing in our kids. So in Mind Up, the brain breaks are critical. And these typically take the form of breathing exercises that help children bring their attention to their present. And children learn that connection between the brain breaks. It's not just about telling kids to calm down or sit and breathe, but it's learning how to self-regulate. And again, we have some videos on our website under our Mind Up project that show kids doing a brain break and that have teachers talking about it. In terms of teaching children how their brains work, there's a couple of great resources online. I really like Cosmic Kids, and again, Cosmic Kids and Go Noodle both have kind of yoga activities and mindfulness and movement. They have quite a few different types of activities. The one link I provided here is from Cosmic Kids, and it tells a little story about the owl and the guard dog in your brain, and how the guard dog, or the amygdala, plays a really important function of sensing danger, and the owl is much more wise and contemplative and helps you make good decisions. And it's sometimes when the guard dog is barking and thinks that there's danger and there's not danger, like what that can kind of get you in trouble with. So again, really just helping kids understand their brains. And these slides, I understand, will be posted both where you signed up for the link, and I will post them on our center website as well. There's lots of articles online for teens in terms of teaching them about how their brains work. I've included one link here. And then for parents, Linda Chamberlain has developed a great resource. She was one of the first psychologists to really try to translate neuroscience for a broader audience. And she has this pamphlet, or this little booklet, The Amazing Teen Brain, that I recommend. Okay, so the second strategy I want to talk about is this breathing or mindful awareness. And mindful awareness is really about bringing your attention to the present. So that being really firmly rooted in the right now, in your body, and not being distracted by worries about the future or being distracted by negative things about the past. And so it's this being fully present and just noticing, noticing your body and your sensations, noticing when thoughts drift into your head, and not getting upset about it and thinking, oh, I just can't stop thinking or worrying, but just noticing when your thoughts wander. And we've seen this rise in mindfulness-based interventions. It's still a relatively recent field, especially with children, but there's been some really positive outcomes so far. So, and there's lots of ways to cultivate mindfulness. So MindUp uses a number of them. They use the breathing breaks, which are pretty core practice. They have, some teachers have calming corners. Of mindful activities to start, and we can teach kids to settle and breathe deeply and notice how that feels different in their body, and again, give them that tool for regulation. So the research is relatively new. There have been a few meta-analyses. There's a 2014 meta-analysis by Charlotte Zenner and colleagues who found overall effects for cognitive performance, stress, resilience, and reducing emotional problems. And then a more recent meta-analysis in 2017, Dana Carsley and her colleagues looked at 24 well-designed studies looking at the impact of mindfulness-based interventions on mental health, and saw small to moderate effects, and the effects tended to be bigger for adolescents. So it's interesting that this one intervention has such a broad range of outcomes in terms of improvements in behavior, executive functioning, even working memory, and mental health. So when we think about incorporating mindfulness and breathing into our daily lives, again, the breathing breaks or types of breathing are often a good way to start. This is my youngest on the right here, and she had made a little video for me to show you to how to do butterfly breathing. But again, unfortunately, I'm not able to share that. So there's people use things like having a little stuffy that sits on children's tummies as they lie on the ground, and they practice breathing and trying to breathe right into their belly and make their animal rise up. There's a number of online apps, Headspace, Calm. I've included one here specifically for teens. And the mindfulness for teens has a really nice video of teens talking about how mindfulness has actually changed their experience and their day-to-day kind of functioning. And I have a picture here of a Hoberman sphere, and I guess there's the one caveat about teaching breathing and mindfulness is the time to start teaching it is not when people are upset or tantruming or dysregulated. So something that you practice and that becomes part of a routine, and then as kids get better at it, they start to use it on their own when they feel themselves getting agitated or upset. But it's not something that you want to throw at somebody new when they're really upset and dysregulated. And I have a picture here of a Hoberman sphere, and many of you will recognize this. It's a toy that it's expanded in this picture, and it can shrink down. And we often teach kids to breathe with it, and it's like their diaphragm. It expands. You breathe in, and you close it. That's another good way to teach them to breathe. And about 5 years ago, we went on an RV trip out to PEI, and so our kids at the time were between the ages of 2 and 9, and I brought this Hoberman sphere and some other things to try and do more mindful awareness and breathing with the kids. And it's funny because they really initially saw it more like CPR paddles. So if one of the kids was having a complete meltdown and freaking out, then one of the other kids would say, I'll get the breathing ball, and go running off and come back and like thrust it into their hands. And that's not how we would recommend teaching breathing. It's more useful to teach it at times and to do it with your children when they're feeling more calm and regulated. So the last thing I want to touch on briefly is the idea of practicing gratitude as an intervention. And this has come out of the field of positive psychology, and it's a great example of how some really small interventions can yield a big impact. So gratitude is really, it's more than just good manners or saying thank you. It's a social skill that increases connections to others and helps youth secure benefits from others. So gratitude can help children's development by fostering a general sense of connectedness to the other, the community, and society at large, as well as motivation to use their strengths to broadly contribute. And research shows that gratitude contributes to well-being over and above related factors like being generally pro-social or having good social skills. So it's not just about having kids that say please and thank you, but seems to be something unique to be gained by gratitude. And the good news is that gratitude can really be cultivated and strengthened. So there was a neat study where they had 3 conditions with early adolescents. They had a gratitude condition, a hassles condition, and a control condition. And it was a very brief intervention. For 8 days, the gratitude conditions every day basically had to make a list of 5 things in the previous day that you're grateful for. The hassles condition, had to think of up to 5 things, hassles in the past day, and the control group did neither and just completed the measures. And what they found, and this is the graphs for their life satisfaction outcome, but they're similar for the other positive and negative outcomes, is that we see an intervention impact both immediately after and at 3-week follow-up. And again, it's pretty compelling that you make a list of 5 things for 8 days straight, and it actually has this ongoing impact. So it's pretty powerful intervention and one that doesn't take a lot of time. And there's lots of different ways to incorporate gratitude into daily routines. Often at dinner, we just go around quick, one thing that you're grateful for today, and it has to be specific. And there's tons of gratitude journals and templates available online that kids can fill in. Gratitude letters have been evaluated as interventions as well, which is writing a very specific letter expressing gratitude. It gets more than saying, thanks for the Christmas present, but really sort of thinking deeply about how to express what something has meant to you, and it has benefits for the letter writer. It's also a nice thing to do at bedtime, especially with kids who worry, to just try to help do that sort of positive orientation. And it's not about reframing or trying to cause this sort of unrealistic sunshine of everything's great right now, but that ability to find things that we're grateful for. It can have a huge impact on well-being and depression, and even at times of stress like right now. So in summary, I would say that the current pandemic is not the time to try to introduce huge changes to routines, but maybe think about some of these small daily practices that can foster resilience. So we can support children's well-being by learning how stress our bodies and how our brains work, and teaching it to them. So if this was new information about how our brains wire up and different parts of the brain and what they do, then take a look at some of those resources I shared and share them with your child. We can support children's well-being by doing breathing practice together, and also by encouraging gratitude behaviors. And the nice thing is all of these things have been shown in the adult intervention literature to have a really significant impact for us too, which is different than trying to take an approach like developing a sticker chart to make sure everyone's doing their homework and making their beds right now. Like that's the kind of intervention that can cause more stress for a family right now if it's new, whereas these are all things that we can incorporate that are going to have impacts for us. And at the end of the day, we often use this phrase, this put on your own mask first, so much that it's in danger of becoming trite. But I think that this current pandemic is a perfect example that the best resource kids have is their relationship with an adult who's managing well. And that, again, the strategies that I shared today are all ones that you can do together, and that will have a positive impact for you and your children as we all navigate this challenging time. So thank you so much for joining us. I have a few links here, both to our website, which will have information about our projects, and we'll add the slides there today. And you're welcome to contact me as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. We have a few questions. If I can just start with a few of those. I guess I have a question about what behaviors to watch for in your child if your child is feeling stressed. Like, are there signs that are general, or how can we notice if our child is stressed?
Sure, great question. So it's one of those questions that I feel like psychologists, we always say, well, it depends. And it does depend. It depends a little bit on their age. So stress behaviors in young children might look more like disruptions to some of their routines. They're eating, they're sleeping, they're sort of being more cranky. And I think anything that's really looks different. So one of the things that's difficult as a parent is some of the behaviors that can be related to stress look just defiant and irritating to us. So kids being more argumentative or kind of more mopey and not wanting to do things, those can all be stress behaviors. And I think the thing to think about in terms of whether you would want to seek additional intervention is, are they causing significant distress to the child and to the family? So if it's just that everybody feels a little bit off and people, maybe this kid's a little more weepy than usual and this one seems a bit more grumpy, that's a really natural response to really unusual circumstances. It's when they get to the point that it's causing a lot of distress and they're not able to do the other things they need to do that you might want to reach out for some help.
Are there ways to acknowledge when you notice that your child is stressed without exacerbating it? I'm trying to think of an example. Like, you don't want to make things worse, so you don't want to say, "Oh, are you feeling stressed about COVID-19?" Or
yes, okay, great question. Yeah, there are ways, and that's a really important building block of self-regulation, because the first step is emotional literacy, or being able to recognize and name your feelings. And so if you say, "Are you stressed?" or "How are you feeling?" like they may not know, but it's a pretty safe approach to just to sort of say what you notice. Like, it seems like it's harder for you to fall asleep, and this is challenging, and I think the way we talk about COVID with kids is really important. So I think this holds true for adults too. You want to stay away from the doom surfing of constant Twitter feeds and news articles that are just going to feel overwhelming. But it's especially important with kids to think about how much exposure they have to things that they can't really wrap their heads around or understand. So you're always going to think about the age of the kids and how much information you want to share. And I think focusing on how it's affecting them. So there's a lot of disappointed kids out there who are not going to get to do their grade 8 or grade 12 grad, who are really looking forward to their band trip or their visit to their grandparents, and those are really big things to them. And as adults, I think we can acknowledge that and validate it without sort of diminishing it and saying, well, you're so lucky, at least your parent still has a job and nobody's died, or because we're seeing that much bigger picture, but really keeping it in scope of kind of children's worlds is important.
So just to build on that a bit, when talking to kids about real issues and things that people are facing right now, and taking into consideration their age or their maturity, how honest should we be about certain things that are going on? Obviously the issues of the day, but how it's affecting people and how it's affecting home lives and jobs and that sort of thing. Should you be completely honest, or should you temper it?
Yeah. Yep. So you know your kids best. It's not ever useful to turn them into the parents or adults. And I think it's absolutely okay to, especially if you've acted badly, to say, you know what, I lost my cool there. I'm worried about things at work, and I'm sorry. Like, it's okay to kind of say that, but not getting into deep information about family finances or worries. It is challenging because lots of the strategies that we use with kids who are anxious, so often when kids are anxious, it's because they have unrealistic appraisals of things, so that they, a child who's really afraid of a dog, you can do lots of work to show that in general, like 99% of the time, dogs are actually not dangerous, and you can work towards them understanding that. This is a really different situation because it has gotten close, and depending on what you read, 6 months from now, everybody will know somebody who's passed away from this. So it is really different. And I don't think, we do any favors to pretend that. I think one thing is balancing out, do you talk about COVID every single day? And certainly at the beginning, our family was getting caught into that. There was new information every day, and it was so top of mind. But can you even just kind of compartmentalize how much of that that space is being given to it in your family?
All right, thank you. I have a few questions about Mind Up. Is it available to the public?
Yeah, so Mind Up was designed for teachers, and honestly, you can buy the manual on Amazon. But there's some of those other links I gave have just as good strategies for using it at home, because Mind Up, the manual's written for teachers, but it's certainly worth taking a look at. There's lots of good resources, and I think it's a really nice one to be able to learn and do with your kids, because again, mindfulness interventions, gratitude interventions, all are really useful for adults as well.
All right, wondering about any tips on homeschooling, because there's a lot of stress around that.
Yes.
And any suggestions on how to manage that? But, you know, some kids are naturally drawn to social media. How do you keep it so it's not maybe picking up the family?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So we had a huge homeschool fail this week. Our 10-year-old seems to be doing his work in about 17 minutes a week. And we looked and it looked like he had done everything and we couldn't figure out what's going on. And 2 days ago, I realized I'd missed signing up to 3 additional classrooms. So his French, his music, and something else. And we're now 3 weeks of assignments behind those. And I think, you know, each family's going to have to decide where they fall on this. For me, I'm very clear the priority is, you know, the well-being of our family and our kids, and the kids feeling connected and safe right now. It's easy, you know, with kids in younger grades, I'm not that worried about kids falling behind. So my bias is to read your kids and take it day by day. And the reality is I'm working, I had 9 hours of Zoom calls yesterday, and so does my husband. So even though we have lots of privilege in certain ways for how we're handling this pandemic, it would mean sitting down at 5 o'clock and starting my grade 1's, you know, literacy work. So the messaging certainly from the school boards has been that these are not supposed to be causing stress, and that they're, you know, that they're going to be flexible. So I think that just even remembering that learning happens in so many ways. So if you can engage your kids in doing other things, even if they're going to be online, what are they doing online, or what are they watching? Are they reading? Can they spend some time on Duolingo, working on a language, even if it's not getting through all the assignments on the exact time? You know, my bias is that it's not worth adding that additional stress or breakdown to families. I'll write you a note. I'll write you a note for your teacher. So, no. And the teachers I've talked to get it. There's such a range of circumstances and children, and how children are managing. And our older two are quite independent and just whizzing through all their work. But I'm finding it very difficult to manage all our work and other responsibilities, and also oversee the grade 1 and grade 4. So,
okay, thank you. For children who have past trauma and have been triggered by isolation, are there additional strategies we can use to support them as we wait to access resources such as therapy? Particularly, how would you suggest that a parent help a child who is struggling with negative, intrusive thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. This experience will be so triggering for kids. Even, you know, you think about something like that experience of lining up outside a grocery store, and how that feels for maybe new Canadians who came here as refugees and who've had that experience other times under really scary circumstances. So I think part of having kind of this trauma-informed mentality, even recognizing that kids are being triggered, is a really important first step, because it means that you're going to look at it with a different lens. So if kids are kind of lashing out or acting up, instead of trying to sort of coerce them into behaving better, it's really understanding that. And again, any of that kind of validation we do with kids of, you know, this we know this is hard. The activities I shared today are all useful in terms of anything that's self-soothing. So any kind of breathing or movement things, grounding exercises that help kids feel more settled in their bodies can help. And certainly there are services that are still taking new clients even during the pandemic. So I know our Child and Youth Development Clinic at Western, for example, has pivoted really nicely to telepsych, and is able to do consultations and some therapy is needed. So there are some services out there, and yeah, recognizing that for kids who have past trauma histories, even kids who've had lots of disrupted relationships, it was such an abrupt end to sort of school and all these other activities, that can feel, again, that can trigger some of those same feelings of abandonment or sort of disrupted relationships.
All right, thank you. That concludes the questions. So thank you for taking the time to learn with us. And thank you, Claire. You presented a lot of useful content